Hey everybody, this is Vegan Theology with Sarah and Kevin Hale.
Hi, everyone, and we are very, very excited. We have Carol J. Adams here with us today. She has graciously granted us a conversation, an interview, and I wanted to start by reading some of her biographical information since we haven't been talking about her on the podcast up until this point. Carol graduated with a bachelor's degree from the University of Rochester, and while she was an undergraduate there, she was involved in bringing women's studies courses to the university's course catalog. And then she obtained her Master's of Divinity degree from Yale Divinity School in 1976. She moved to Boston to study with Mary Daly, and she describes that relationship as a fascinating time of conversation and mutual critique. She began to think about patriarchal ethics and how they naturalize and normalize violence and perpetuate human exceptionalism that permit the oppression of other beings. And from this line of thinking, her theory of the patriarchal essence began, and the creation of her very famous book, The Sexual Politics of Meat, a feminist vegetarian critical theory, took form. The Sexual Politics of Meat has been described as the Bible of the vegan community and is now in a Bloomsbury Revelations edition celebrating its 35th anniversary edition. And it has been translated into German, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Turkish, Portuguese, Polish, Spanish, and French.
Wow.
And eventually she ended up publishing a companion book called The Pornography of Meat. But she's the author of several other books, including Living Among Meat Eaters, a vegetarian survival handbook. Her activism includes experience of working for social justice and against domestic violence, homelessness, racism, and violence against animals. Adams has supported animal rights, and she wants to educate people about vegan food too, and introduce people to vegan eating. She explains we all get protein from plants. Some people get it directly from plants, and others choose to let animals process the protein for them. She has also coined the term feminized protein to describe eggs and dairy products, and that it is protein that is produced by using the reproductive cycle of female animals. She started a hotline for battered women in Western New York, and she's written several books about domestic abuse, many of them targeting the clergy and written for pastors. For example, there's a training manual she wrote, Pastoral Care for Domestic Violence, Case Studies for Clergy, as well as Violence Against Women and Children, a Christian Theological Source Book. She wrote one of the earliest articles theorizing why batterers harm animals. Adams was executive director of the Chautauqua County Rural Ministry Incorporated in Dunkirk, New York from the late 70s to 87. She lives in Texas with her husband, Reverend Dr. Bruce Buchanan, and is a member of the First Presbyterian Church of Dallas, where her husband is an associate pastor. Welcome, Carol, to the Vegan Theology Podcast.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Kevin.
Yeah.
We're so excited to have you here. We would love to discuss primarily your book, your very famous book, The Sexual Politics of Meat. But I thought first I would explain to our listeners how I'm going to go ahead and call what we have a friendship, even though I know it's brand new. How this friendship started, because this past summer, we had the idea of starting a daily podcast called The Vegan's Almanac. And in my mind, my vision for it was that we would end each day's podcast with a moment of beauty, a prayer or a meditation or a poem. And so of course, we were scrambling to kind of find some things. And Kevin purchased your book, Prayers for Animals. And I started looking through it and I was just blown away. These prayers are so beautiful. They're not condescending to animals. They're not cute. They're heartfelt and honest and so worshipful. And so I was so excited. And we thought we should probably ask your permission to read these on our podcast. And so I think Kevin found your email address and we asked you, and you immediately were so gracious and kind and said, yeah, of course, use them. And in your email signature, I saw coming soon, the 35th anniversary of The Sexual Politics of Meat, which I had heard of that book before, didn't really know anything about it. And I thought, oh, that's really nice that she's advertising that book. And it took me like several days to start to put it together that you are the author, not only of these beautiful prayers, but of the, what has been called the Bible of the vegan community.
Yeah.
Oh, well, oh, that's wonderful.
So,
Oh, and at one point she's like, "Are we talking to the Carol Adams?" And I'm like, "Yeah."
yeah, a mind-blowing experience to say the least. Our listeners of Vegan Theology, some of them are familiar with Vegan's Almanac and have no doubt heard many of your prayers read on that podcast. But just for those listeners who haven't, I wanted to go ahead and just read one of them. Dear God, today I lift my voice in praise and thanksgiving for all the wonderful beings who exist in this world. Today, I lift my voice in praise and thanksgiving for those wonderful beings with whom I live. Today, I lift my voice in praise and thanksgiving for the small and the large, those near and those far, for the two-legged and the four-legged and the no-legged. And today, I remember in my heart and my prayers, elephants who have lost a loved one, chimpanzees and gibbons and other cousins of ours sold in captivity, worms washed onto sidewalks by rain who die. I remember in my heart and my prayers those with names and those with no names, the small and the large, those near and those far, those who walk and those who are unable to walk. I remember in my heart and my prayers those who, because of cages, cannot this day even lift their wings or move their bodies. Today, I lift my voice in praise and thanksgiving, and I remember all of us, your animals, in my heart and in my prayers. And I know that today I have work to do. I was scared there I was going to start choking up.
Oh, but it's very sweet. And you know what? It was like, I don't know what was happening, but it was as though the sun was coming through a window as you read. Suddenly, when you started reading, your face was lit up by a light that hadn't been there. So I thought, well, this is very moving.
Oh my gosh.
So thank
Yes.
you.
Well, it just speaks to your multi-dimensional work and your life, that you have this deep spiritual theme that just runs through everything you do, is how I perceive a lot of what I've been exposed to so far. I think our listeners definitely know that we come from very conservative Christianity. We've spent all of our lives in very fundamentalist, evangelical, conservative Christianity. And it feels for both of us, like especially the last year or two, we've started to come awake and start to move away from some of that. And I was noticing as I was doing some reading, and specifically, I think your forewords to The Sexual Politics of Meat, that your journey was more, if I understand it correctly, you were a feminist who ended up becoming a vegan. And for us, it's been a very different journey where we've been vegans who are just beginning to explore feminism. I would say we would both agree that this is probably the first overtly feminist text that we've exposed ourselves to.
Yeah.
And so I think I wanted to just ask, mostly for our benefit, but also for our listeners' benefit, how have all of these threads of your spirituality, your feminism, your veganism kind of shaped each other and been reconciled to each other and complement each other?
Well, I would say I think they're held in tension, sort of like when you think of that string game, Cat's Cradle, where you have all these strings around your hands, and you're moving the strings around in their patterns. Have I described it enough that you can imagine that?
Yeah.
I would not say they all neatly intersect, and I would say that sometimes I get knotted up by them. And clearly, that you could look at the prayers for animals and not connect it with that other Carol Adams. The work can be siloed, and not seen as sort of yoked or linked. But if I were to describe it, which isn't easy. I mean, when you think about spirituality and what gets you up in the morning, in a sense, and those prayers, maybe I should start with the prayers and work backwards, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I think I started writing those prayers after the death of a rabbit. And we had taken this rabbit in, well, so this is how life intersects. This is how the cat's cradle of the string. So Bruce, my partner, my husband, had run this homeless day shelter. And many animals were brought in there during the 30 years he ran it. He subsequently retired, but during that time, dogs were brought in and cats. Somebody brought in a snake, birds, and the staff would take them. And then one day, a woman came in, and she had in her hand the smallest little bunny, and she said that the mother had been attacked outside of the Greyhound bus station in downtown Dallas. And everybody looked at this little bunny and said, well, Bruce, you need to take this home to Carol. She's going to be the one who has the ability to figure out what the bunny needs. So he brought the bunny home. I took it immediately to the vet. The bunny had an infection on all four of her little paws and an infection on her tail. And she had to be fed with an eye drop. So every day I fed her with the eye drop, and I had to soak her little feet and her tail in a medicine every day to get rid of the infection. And she grew, and there's a picture I could send you of me holding her. By the time I'm holding her in my hand, she'd grown. She was like 3 weeks older. And we had her as part of our life. We already had another bunny. We had been taking in homeless bunnies for a while now. And then one night a cat attacked her, and I rushed her to a overnight vet place, and her back had been broken, and she died. And I was just riven with grief. I mean, here is someone I'd held in my hand and nurtured, and she was dead. And I remember walking in a park and thinking, I need to process this. I need to figure out how to grieve this. And I have to put you on pause while I let another animal from the stew pot, a homeless dog who wants to go outside. Hold on. Okay. He's not homeless now, of course. Anyway, I decided I would do a practice of writing a prayer every morning, and that I would just find my voice that way. And also, Garrison Keillor's Writer's Almanac, he did a collection of poems, good poems, I think it is, but he talked about how rarely we do poems of adoration, poems of celebration, poems of affirmation. And I wanted to find a way to affirm and have adoration and celebration in the midst of grief, because we live in the midst of grief if we're vegans and aware of what's happening to animals. And so I took a notebook and just started writing down these experiences or these thoughts.
Wow.
And eventually they became that book. So I think openness to the spirit, which can be called intuition or spirituality. I remember when I was working on the book on woman battering for ministers, that I met with a pastoral care professor, and he said he defines spirituality as answering the question, what am I going to do with my life? What am I going to do with my day? I mean, there's the famous Mary Oliver poem, what am I going to do with my one beautiful day? I think it is. But yeah, spirituality is the way we answer that question. Spirituality is having that question as a meaningful defining of who we are, and then the answering of that. So just one other autobiographical thing. I grew up around horses and dogs, cats. I feel that they were part of the group of beings who nurtured me, not just my family or teachers or friends, but that I came to know myself through my relationships with non-human animals as well. And the first year that the prayers for animals came out, there was a workshop I did at the North American Vegetarian Society's Veg Fest. And I was asked about that. And I realized that animals had given me so much in my life. I'll never be done responding to processing, in some language, or returning to them what they gave me as I grew up.
Mm.
And so the prayers flowed from that.
Hmm.
Certainly, it's a very different voice from Sexual Politics of Meat. So I should also say that I am someone who argues with what I read, what I hear, or what I see. That becomes a social justice activism when you're arguing in a public way to stop, racist practices, or to try to create more responsive medical and legal treatment for battered women back in the 70s. And because my mind works synthetically, synthesizing, constantly holding things in tension, that cat's cradle in your hand of all those different strings, those strings are going to start vibrating. And so when I was working on domestic violence, it was just so clear ministers were making mistakes. Why are they making mistakes? Well, one reason they make mistakes is because batterers say, I'm sorry, I've repented. And ministers believed them. So I wanted to, write about that. And also, ministers telling women they needed to forgive the batterer because he had repented. But what's repentance? Repentance isn't just saying, I'm sorry. Repentance is turning around. Repentance is showing empathy for the victim. And that I realized there were things I could say that argued with sort of the traditional way that ministers were responding. And that same kind of argument evolved as I started, once I became a vegetarian in 1974, and already being a feminist, and then reading and putting through my mind all these gears working. Well, look at this vegetarian feminist, look at this vegetarian suffragist, look at this example of needed patriarchy. So it's sometimes my mind makes a leap, and then it takes me 15 years to finish a book. It's like, no more ideas. But anyway, I think my mind is very alive to connections.
Wow. I mean, there's so much that you said there that I would love to pick up on and go with. In terms of Christianity and feminism, and I mean, I appreciate that you said sometimes they don't nicely overlap, or it does feel like there's a tension there. Kevin had an experience this past weekend at work.
Well, actually, just a couple of days ago, there's a young student. we're in Bozeman, Montana. There's a university here, University of Montana. And at work, a student I was talking to, I was actually telling her about your book. She was actually reading Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale. And I said, oh, I just got done reading Carol Adams' Sexual Politics of Meat. She mentions Margaret Atwood several times in this book. And we just started talking about it. And then somehow it came up that we did this vegan theology podcast. And I said we were going to be interviewing you. But she said to me, and this is interesting because I almost feel like we can connect our veganism to the text, the biblical text, more easily than our feminism. But one of the questions she had for me, and I just didn't have a good answer, was by the way, she grew up as a pastor's kid in an evangelical free church. And she said, how do you connect your feminism? Because she said, now I'm a feminist and she's having trouble with her faith. How does she connect her feminism to the Bible? And I was kind of like, I didn't have a great answer. And I thought, wow, not to throw this on you, but I mean, there are people out there struggling.
There is some wonderful, wonderful work. When I was in divinity school, that was our struggle, was that, at Yale, there's a room, the RSV room, where the Revised Standard Version was worked on. And, it's all pictures of men. And I remember my Old Testament class in the fall of 72. And the professor made a joke about the old woman who learned Greek so she could speak to God in his own language. And I went up to him afterwards and I said, don't you have any little old men jokes? And he looked at me and I said, well, who are these pastors going to have in their congregations are going to have little old women, and you're teaching ministers to patronize these women.
Mm.
And I dropped the class. But, you know, in the 70s, we searched for material. There is so much wonderful material. Elisabeth Fiorenza's In Memory of Her, that completely redoes our way of thinking about the New Testament.
Mm.
The work of Rosemary Ruether, who writes about ecology, patriarchy, colonialism. I would send her to those two. The Womanist texts by African American theologians who engage with, say, the banning of Hagar, the sending out of Hagar, and bring acute understanding of biblical texts. There's a wealth of material. I think we have to struggle with a variety of things as we talk about the Bible or the Hebrew scriptures, the New Testament. We know that the word deacon was translated differently if it referred to men versus women. So you had a translation problem.
Right.
We know that feminists of the 19th century engaged with this. Elizabeth Cady Stanton edited the Woman's Bible,
Mm.
and it was responding to different texts in the Bible. There is, I remember when I was at Yale, I did my paper on the rape of Tamar from 2 Samuel 13. Now, this is 1975, and I know there's wonderful biblical writings now that get this, but as I read about her, I'm sure your listeners know, you know, Tamar is ordered to take this bread to Amnon, and he rapes her. And one of the commentators said she, you know, in a sense, she tempted him with the bread. And it, you know, the blaming of the woman. So when we talk about Christianity and the Bible and feminism, we have to talk about, is the translation accurate? Who did the translation?
Yeah.
Is the interpretation accurate? Have we understood the setting, Mary and Martha, or you know, the woman at the well? Do we understand what is actually going on there?
Mm.
And third, what's the hermeneutics? How is it being applied?
Mm.
So that you've got, you know, when ministers say battered women can't leave the marriage, they're breaking the marriage. But you could say the violence broke the marriage.
Right.
The violence sundered the marriage.
Mm.
And you've got all those levels of interpretation. And I can just say there is vibrant work being done on
Right.
that.
Okay.
On the other hand, I would also, talking about Bruce, my spouse, he went to Union Theological Seminary, and back in the 70s, you know, after we were married, to get the hotline going, it was hard. We were in a rural area. So he said, well, it takes a different kind of person to start something than to continue it. And if we start it, we'll get other people. So we put it in our house, the manse, and we put it at my office at the church where he worked, which was where my office was for my rural ministry. And it was true. We then, you know, were able to identify other people to come and help us. Then finding that we had to argue with ministers about interpretation on the one hand, and then these ministers would come to us and say, I was doing pastoral counseling of a couple, you know, and it was only later that I found out that she'd been sitting there bleeding from the head the whole time because he pushed her against the wall and a nail had been sticking out, and it had never come up. So it was a pastoral crisis as well, because
Right.
he had no skills to pick up on that.
Right.
But we, you know, women who were told, you must sacrifice for Jesus. You must, you know, Jesus sacrificed. You must sacrifice to bring your husband to Jesus. And here in Texas, a woman called and said, well, you know, how long must I do this? He for 13 years, when he walked by her at any time, he'd throw a glass of cold water on her and said, you know, by your putting up with this, you're bringing me to Jesus. And, you know, my response was, Jesus only hung on the cross for one day.
Yeah.
Mm.
You know, if we're going to use
Yeah.
the New Testament, let's be practical. You can look, there's an American Medical Association article about Jesus on the cross. What is it, 9 hours, 12 hours? Battered women who go through years because they're going to bring, they have to suffer like Jesus on the cross. No, it's
Right.
wrong. I mean, I think the problem for Christianity and Christians struggling with feminist issues is learning that interpretation is flawed and biased, and it is okay to ask questions.
Mm.
You are, if Christianity can't handle questions, it is not what we need. Anyway, back to Bruce. So we've started this outline, and then the terrible thing in Jim Jones and Guyana happened, where people are forced to drink this poisoned Kool-Aid. Bruce did this beautiful sermon, and he said, if anyone tells you you cannot get to God but through them, you know not to trust them. And I think we have to view the whole issue around Christianity in the same way. When someone tells you that this is how to interpret something, or that this doesn't allow it, women can't be allowed to be elders and ministers because of Paul. Don't trust it. There is so much self-interest and narcissism in the Christian church that we have to always have questions that we're bringing to the interaction. And feminism offers us some wonderful questions.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, thank you for clarifying. I think because I wouldn't want to misstate or be misunderstood that we are of the opinion that there isn't plenty of a world of research and development of aligning feminism with Christianity. It exists. We just haven't exposed ourselves to it.
Right.
And this is the first time that we kind of started to read someone who's writing in this tradition. And yeah, we both feel like our eyes are being opened for sure.
It's a very exciting path that you're on.
Yeah.
So for instance, when Marie Fortune, who was a classmate of mine at Yale and went on to create a whole center around preventing sexual and domestic violence and educating denominations, that the book you referred to about violence against women and children, Christian Theological Source Book, it's 520 pages long. And when it came out, I think the National Catholic Reporter said, if there's one book you read this year, read this one. It is huge. And there's a wonderful article by about forgiveness. And it points out, it looks very closely at when Jesus forgave. And that even at the end, when Jesus is on the cross, Jesus doesn't forgive them. Jesus says, forgive them, Father. And what he argues is that forgiveness can never come from someone who is disempowered. The person who is empowered, who has the power, can forgive those, hierarchically below them. You can forgive rent. You can forgive debts. But the person who is weaker or less powerful in all the different social ramifications is never the one obliged to forgive. I think it's a remarkable article. I haven't read it for 30 years, but it still stands out. And the article that we did by Marjorie Proctor Smith about liturgy, how liturgy carries patriarchal presumptions. Who decides what the passages are that are read, say in Presbyterian, like this is the Presbyterian calendar. And the reading for yesterday, the sixth Sunday after Epiphany, was Jeremiah, Psalm 1, Corinthians, and Luke 6. Who decides that?
Right.
Because what she found was that stories of women had been left out. Or when we're sitting there and doing a corporate prayer of forgiveness and you're sitting next to your batterer, do you really have to have a corporate forgiveness for everybody? That the presumptions of Christianity that are acted out through worship carry patriarchal implications that actually can harm victims. or children who've been abused, and they're sitting next to the person who's abused them, who are supposed to say this corporate prayer. As they say, turning around a huge boat like the Queen Mary or whatever takes a long time. Well, that's how the church works. I mean, don't even get us started on the church and eating animals.
Right.
The church will throw out, you'll how many times have I heard Genesis 1:26?
Yeah.
Not even citing it right.
Yeah.
But why does a meat eater who doesn't follow God about anything else suddenly find God very comforting because they eat meat? It's just
Right.
it's untrustworthy.
Right. No, I feel the same way. I feel like if anybody should be vegan, it should be the church, Christians.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, good luck with that. Seriously. I mean, one of the things we did, so here we are in Texas, we're in Dallas, and there was a over 50s group, which became, over the years we were there, an over 60s group, and over 70s group, and over 80s group. And they held a 4th of July picnic. Now, I'm from the north, and the first year we went to a 4th of July picnic in Dallas, and it's 100 degrees, and there's 100 people. And I think, what are they thinking?
Right.
And of course, you learn that you just do things in the heat anyway down here. But
Yeah.
as they aged, they lost the people who hosted that. And I said to Bruce, if all they need is our backyard, have them come here. So the first year, of course, it turned out that they were now getting Kentucky Fried Chicken, and they called Bruce and said nobody had picked it up. Could he go pick it up? And I thought, this can never happen again. This is this. So I ended up making Miyoko's unribs from Miyoko's vegan home pantry.
Yep.
And it takes 3 days. And I'm making 5 or 6 times the amount. And it's a lot of gluten, but you make it, you bake, you fry it, you put it in a sauce. She provides, she gives you the recipe for the sauce, and then you reheat it. And here are these wonderful octogenarians and nonagenarians in the church. And I've made a vegan mac and cheese that's very rich. And when I saw one of the nonagenarians, 90-year-olds,
Yeah.
go back for a third helping of the mac and cheese, I thought, I'm in heaven. And one of them, who was 96, told me that she was asked the next week, how was the barbecue? Oh, I had the best ribs ever. You mean the best vegan ribs? No, they were the best ribs ever. So, that was my little, that was so much fun. Yeah, so we would call those vegan propaganda meals. And like every year when they used to do potlucks, and I would make a tofu cream pie, which I hope all your listeners know how simple that is, where you melt ethically sourced chocolate chips with some silken tofu. And if you really want to, have it be real creamy, add a little of Miyoko's cream cheese and a little vanilla and put it in a vegan graham cracker crust, and you've got it,
Yeah.
Well, you don't have to tell anybody that that's what you've made, and you don't want to. People, because this is my byword. People are perfectly happy eating vegan food as long as they don't know that's what they're doing.
Oh, yep.
It's their minds that are keeping them from this. It's not their stomachs.
No,
Their
I
stomachs
agree with you.
are perfectly happy.
No, right on. I used to take food into work, and I had my boss, they would devour it. I used to be a UPS driver, and it was a blue collar shop, and a lot of hunters were in Montana. But my boss said to me, if you didn't tell anyone this was vegan, they wouldn't know, right? So to your point, yes, like a lot of times because guys knew it was vegan, they wouldn't touch it, right? But
Yeah. I really do want to circle back to what we're talking about right now, because your section in this book on the dinner time conversation when a vegetarian happens to be eating with a bunch of, people on the standard diet and how that goes. But before we get into that, I think our listeners might be a little bit confused about what are the sexual politics of meat. And I know this conversation is not going to do it justice. It's not going to do this book justice. There's so much in this book. We've talked about how we we need to just come back to this book
Yeah.
perennially, like
Yeah, I feel like this
every
is
year.
definitely one of those books. You're just going to have to read it, absorb it. You're going to have to come back to it every 2 years or something and just read it again. It's
I just had to read it again. um, Before we move away from religion, let me just tell your listeners
Sure.
about Creature Kind, that organization, Creature Kind.
Yeah.
yep.
They have a lot of resources. They're really trying to work with the churches. They're a great group. So please look up Creature Kind, do your web surfing and go there. They do interviews, they do articles, and they've created materials. Really, I would think your listeners would be very, very
Yeah.
happy to know about that resource.
Was
Yeah.
it started by Clough, David Clough?
David
Yeah,
Clough,
Dave,
maybe?
yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
I know we only have a limited amount of time and hopefully we can have many more conversations with you, but I just love the fact that you have a Master of Divinity from Yale, that you studied, you were at Harvard too, but like just all of it, your whole thing, what an activist you are to actually have battered women live in your own home. I mean, I don't know how many Christians today would do something like that. You're such an inspiration. And so I just want to say that to you, that you're like boots on the ground a lot. Like, and I think in one of your books, somebody said something to you about being what was it?
When Sexual Politics of Meat came out, some of the reaction was, labeling you as
An
some
academic.
kind of, yeah,
Right.
ivory tower academic.
Yeah, you're like, I'm an activist. Like, you know what
Yeah,
I mean?
well, no, right. Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I can anatomize a passion for justice, except to say, I grew up believing and seeing through my parents that when there's something wrong, you do something about it. You speak
Mm,
up, you witness, all those things. You don't stay on the sideline. I mean, the problem about Christianity and apocalypse for that some people believe that the environmental crisis is the apocalyptic crisis that's going to take us away. Well, Bruce drove to church every day with a bumper sticker that said, "When the apocalypse comes, may I have your car?" But
oh man.
so I'm going to tell you, there are people who have waited for the apocalypse in 1840, and there were people waiting for the apocalypse. I mean, what is the apocalypse? We don't even know how to define it.
Mm,
And the idea that any belief that the apocalypse takes us from responsibility for here and now is really sinful, I think. And that it causes people to not care about the environment because that's the way we're going to, get to this next world or
mm,
be lifted up or whatever. There's another hierarchy that heaven is above us and all that. But it seems to me that when Jesus says, what we've done for those around us, those suffering,
Yep.
that's the measure of who we are. Where is Matthew 25 for apocalyptic thinking? I mean,
mm.
either deal with it or say, you know what, we're really not interested in what Jesus talks about.
Exactly.
Yep.
Because Jesus is not apocalyptic in that way.
Mm.
So either, shut up or get to work.
Yeah,
Because
exactly.
but again, the reason they can get away with it, there is already a tradition and a hierarchy that's allowing them to place themselves there. And
Mm,
that's why evangelicals went for Trump and Trump went for evangelicals. It was not a marriage made in heaven, it was a marriage made in hell.
mm,
And the idea that all these male clergy suddenly discover that obedient women at home is the right thing is sinful. I
mm,
mean, Mary and Martha, somebody was out there doing things, spilling perfume. Are they rebutting that now?
mm,
So there's so many reasons to be suspicious of that alignment,
mm,
but the fact that it actually violates everything Jesus taught should be where it gets started.
mm.
Right.
Now that you want me to, I know you don't mean to have me leap from that to what sexual politics of meat, but the idea that men need meat or men should be fed meat, that meat is, makes you virile,
Yeah.
that's another kind of mythology.
Mm.
And that's where sexual politics of meat starts. The first chapter is
Yeah.
looking at this mythology. And I even quote Elisabeth Cady Stanton from the Woman Bible, where she, complains that the men got to eat the meat. I don't remember which Hebrew scripture she's commenting on, but at this point, but this idea that virility comes from eating these poor butchered animals who never saw light till they're transported to the slaughterhouse. It's perverse.
Yeah.
Really, I mean, in all of this, they say, there's a saying you can't argue with a culture's mythology, but that's what we're doing. This is a mythology. It's not true. It's not true that animal protein is the best protein. It's not true that you have to have meat to live. None of it is true. And, it's as though people are afraid to step outside of the myth that they've accepted. But so the sexual politics of meat makes that argument. And then the other argument is about the connection between the oppression of women and the oppression of animals and how they intersect and overlap. And then the third argument about language, perpetuate dominance, and how we have to cut through that language to speak truth, speak truth to power.
The language part was just one of, they're all wonderful, but yeah, the idea of the fact that you brought in that Adam's first task was naming, and the creative power of what this man-made language and what we name things, how that affects our culture. It builds, we could build culture around what we decide to name things, and then we can rename them to something that is more true, more empowering, more bringing more freedom. So I love that section too.
I mean, there's just so much to talk about. And again, hopefully we can have more conversations with you, but maybe you could just talk about the absent referent and how that's used, and how you have this, say, a whole animal, a whole cow, a whole pig. It's got its own life, whatever, but then it gets dismembered and renamed, and then it becomes this absent reference. I mean, maybe obviously you can say it better than I can.
No, you said it very well. You've read well. So the absent referent, the idea was that animals are absent reference in meat eating and in the consumption of dead animals, and that they become absent reference in three ways. They're killed, so their lives are absent to them. They're murdered, dispatched, whatever language we want to use. So they've disappeared as living beings. They're absent. Once that, they're then cut up, because we have to remember, and I'm sure your listeners all, as vegans know, that a body starts to decay the minute there's no blood flowing through it. So the whole response of butchering is trying to perpetuate a body long enough for the body to be consumed, but that means it's fragmented in some ways. Every year at Thanksgiving, I want to stand in the middle of Whole Foods, which I really don't go to much anymore because of Bezos supporting Trump, and scream, "This is not a whole young turkey in your freezer. This is a dismembered, beheaded, dead animal. There is nothing young about it." And I don't, but I mean, there's that language. I mean, the animal, the turkey, is called a turkey, even though the being is dead and beheaded, as I said, and then fragmented in other ways. And then it becomes an absent referent, because the experience of the animal is lifted from their own lives and applied to something else. So, when you say I felt like a piece of meat, but the whole fact of a piece of meat is that it has no feeling. It has been deprived of feeling because it's been deprived of life. So once I thought of that, the absent referent and what was going on with animals, and this is why we have the misnaming. This is everything. So, for instance, we say a leg of lamb. The lamb can't possess her own leg. It can't be a lamb's leg. Or the Super Bowl, how many chicken wings? It's a chicken's wings. The possessive is lost. So that's an example of the absent referent at work.
Right.
So, but I realized women were absent reference in patriarchal worlds. We disappear. And so then the overlap and intersect is the way forms of oppression against women are then lifted and used and applied to animals. So you see sexy chicks wanting to be eaten, sexy cows wanting to give you some of their milk, sexy pigs wanting to give the farmer one more piglet a year. All the sexual apparatus that's associated with patriarchal control of women was applied to animals, so that and I think there's several photos I've been sent of transport trucks in Europe, transporting pigs to slaughter. And on the back are pictures of sexy pigs. And one even had a pig, having sex with another pig. And I thought, here the person is driving behind all these living pigs. And maybe they start to feel a little uneasy, like, oh, I'm behind all these pigs. Where are they going? Oh, are they going to be slaughtered? Well, those are feelings of uneasiness. But then you look at this cartoon creature sexually beckoning to you, in a bikini with lipstick and her eyelashes curled, and you laugh, or your discomfort is released. So I think that there's a kind of very seduction of the sexual that goes on with that. Or women who then, are shown on all fours, so that they're animalized. So one of the sound bites is that animals are feminized and sexualized and women are animalized. And that's part of the nexus of patriarchy.
Well, yeah, and men's reference to women, right? Men will say, "Hey, you're gonna get a piece of ass," or a woman's rack, or whatever it is, right? I mean, it just goes on and on.
Yeah. And then you've got the t-shirts that show the rack, and the rack is the deer's rack. But it's the place where puns on bodies become sort of cruel, oppressive reinforcement of who's the object in your life. So it's a way of perpetuating objectification and keeping from recognizing that you've been manipulated.
Yeah, 100%. And I just love this idea in the book. And I know we're not going to do justice, but this idea, like the final element of this whole progression is this idea of consumption, right? That men are consuming animals, men are consuming women through objectifying them through pornography or whatever, through actual physical, like brothels or whatever. But can you just talk about that consumption aspect? Like it's almost like dominance. It's like full dominance, right? Just something to that effect.
I think you said that very well. And so I talk in chapter 2 about objectification, fragmentation, and consumption. It's simpler to consume someone if they're fragmented, because they're no longer someone. You're consuming body parts, or you're consuming the objectified being. One of the things that we know from reports of rape victims and domestic violence victims is that often the rapist or the batterer will start referring to the person not by a name and not even recognizing them as woman, but as bitch or slut, or that's part of the objectification, is to no longer feel that you have to have empathy for this other being, because that other being has disappeared. And the consumption occurs because of the disappearance of the other being. The being has been consumed categorically, philosophically, theoretically, and literally. Even if she's a living being, a woman, or another non-dominant individual who is being victimized, but they're not seen. I mean, all of that, and what it consumes is equality.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And we're seeing this with Trump right now. Equality was so threatening. All these evangelical male ministers had to side with an autocrat, felon, rapist, rather than accept equality in the church. You cannot get more base than that. That's how threatening equality is. And why do people react the way they do to vegans? All we're doing is sitting there eating our meal. And they're thrusting meat at us, or they want to argue with us for 30 minutes while our food cools off. Equality and care is that threatening.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll just bring it around to our first interview to say all of this comes from a view of compassion, and that compassion isn't divisible. That we feel compassion for a baby rabbit found at the Greyhound bus station, and we feel compassion for a pig in a transport truck, and we feel compassion for those animals we can't even imagine. I think veganism is an act of imagination coupled with compassion. And
Wow.
what is it that we are given in Christianity? That compassion is the most important act, and caring. We don't have to just reserve it for a certain group of people called Homo sapiens. Compassion isn't divisible. The more you give, the more you suddenly discover you have. It's so, I guess I'd bring it around to that a theology and ethic of care and compassion gives us a basis for living in this world. And the reactions against us show us how threatening it is to try to articulate
Wow.
care and compassion as ways of living.
Wow.
Well,
Very powerful.
Yeah, very powerful. Wow, I'm getting chills. I mean, seriously, this is so good. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh my gosh, thank you.
And I know we would love to have more conversations with you. I feel like we just scratched the surface here. So
Yes. I'm sure many of our listeners are very intrigued by your book. So yeah, if all of that sounded interesting to you guys, definitely
check out The Sexual Politics of Meat.
Yes.
By Carol J.
So my website is simply caroljadams.com, and you can write to me from there. And I've appreciated the careful reading you've done and the creation of the Vegan Almanac. And I love that my prayers are out there. They're out of print for your listeners, but I'm trying to figure out what to do about that, how to bring them back into print.
Yeah.
I welcome suggestions.
I mean, it's such a rare resource. There just isn't anything else out there that includes non-human animals in our worship of God. So yes,
they're very valuable. They should be in print. So
thank you. Thank you. Thanks for all your time and all your work and all your effort.
Oh, likewise. Thank you for inspiring us.
Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Wow, what a legend. It's such an honor to witness a woman who has touched so many lives over several decades of activism, advocating, serving, writing, and speaking. And what a blessing to actually get to spend time with her. I mean, seriously, how often do you meet someone who is a minister within the church, a pioneering feminist, and an animal rescuing vegan? And I love how she ended our conversation. For Carol, everything is tied together by one thing: compassion. In her own words, compassion is not divisible. The more you give compassion, the more compassion you realize you have to give. Thank you for listening, everybody. We wish you a beautiful day.